I want to speak to some of the things that the district attorney stated, and my first impression is that the officers obviously saw that Mr. Sanchez had this object. We can see on the video that when Officer Lindsay first drove up, he saw that this individual had this object. And so, that tells me that once they observed that he had this object, their entire mannerisms, their operational plan, what they subsequently did should have changed completely. And de-escalation was mentioned several times. I think it's fair to say that there was absolutely zero de-escalation that was deployed in this particular situation, because you could see on the video that the officers, although they observed that this individual, Mr. Sanchez, had this pipe, they continued to pursue him. They continued to follow him. They continued to observe his activities. They approached him on his own property. There was no effort to fall back to a safe position. There was no effort to establish a perimeter. There was no effort to de-escalate the situation, to evaluate the situation. What was the sense of urgency? There was no need for this matter to be pursued the way it was. Also, just looking at the counter on the videotape that we saw, this entire incident happened less than 2 minutes. Less than 2 minutes when the officers arrived and Mr. Sanchez was shot multiple times. That also, I think, supports the idea that zero escalation, de-escalation was employed. Another point that I think is my takeaway from this press conference is that the district attorney said that the witnesses, the independent witnesses, stated that Mr. Sanchez could not understand what the officers were communicating to him, both in English and in Spanish. Well, we dispute that because we've talked to several of the witnesses, and my co-counsel will speak more to their testimony, but the witnesses I've talked to, they all stated, and I think this was also reported with the press, who also interviewed some of the witnesses, that they all stated they were saying he was deaf. He cannot hear you. He cannot hear at all. He's deaf. Not that he don't understand. So, speaking to him in English is not going to be any more understood by him than speaking to him in Spanish. And the fact that the officers clearly heard these witnesses repeatedly shouting and yelling the entire time that the officers were there that he was deaf also indicates that their entire mannerisms and approach should have changed at that particular point. You don't yell louder, drop the weapon, if you are aware that the person cannot hear you. Not that they don't understand you, but they cannot hear you, literally. He could not hear. This individual was mentally disabled. There's no dispute about that. The district attorney spoke to that. He was also completely and totally deaf, and he was non-communicative. He could not speak. And there's no indication that he made any sounds. Any sounds that he made were inaudible sounds. That's according to all the witnesses, his family, his neighbors, his friends, all the people who interacted with him. So all of this indicates that the officers' conduct was completely and totally unreasonable under the circumstances based on those two factors. So there was no sense of urgency. There was no need to walk onto his property since they observed that he had this pipe in his hand. Why allow him to get within several feet of them? Go back behind your vehicle. Go back behind the truck. Wait for other people to occurred? What was the, no crime had been committed that would have, he had not robbed a bank or he had not committed any type of violent crime. There's no evidence that he had committed a crime at all. He's not going to be, he was not involved in the accident. He was not a passenger in the vehicle or anything like that. So there was just no need. This was an unjustified, unreasonable shooting, and the family is very disturbed about what has occurred here, and so we're going to continue to investigate this matter, and we're going to take the appropriate actions as the evidence dictates. Go ahead, Mr. DeMario.
I think it's really important that you understand that obviously we have not been privy to everything that the district attorney's office has shown today. But I can say that our office has been involved in a very thorough investigation, and we've spoken to many, many witnesses, and the witnesses tell us, eyewitnesses tell us that Mr. Sanchez was not going towards the officers at the time he was shot. We have been told by numerous witnesses that Mr. Sanchez simply turned away from Officer Lindsay and turned towards Officer Barnes. And as soon as he turned towards Officer Barnes, he was shot multiple times. Now, there is no video of the shooting. So anything that anyone is assuming has to go off the eyewitnesses. And the eyewitnesses who have spoken to us and provided us affidavits have been very clear from the outset. Number one, as Mr. Hall stated, they said he cannot hear. And we challenge that the district attorney says that that has nothing to do with this shooting. We believe that is very important in this particular case. But also, they've also been very clear that Mr. Sanchez did not make a movement towards the officers besides turning around. And according to the district attorney's office, Mr. Sanchez was at least 10 feet away from Officer Barnes when he was shot. We do not believe that it's reasonable to shoot an individual who just turns around towards you that are 10 feet away. That cannot be the standard here in Oklahoma City, here in the state of Oklahoma, or in this nation, for our government to kill you on the street when you're 10 feet away and you're not posing an imminent threat or harm to the officer's life. So obviously we see things different than the district attorney. We appreciate the opportunity to get his information, but the individuals that we have interviewed on numerous occasions and have provided us sworn testimony under affidavit under penalty of perjury have stated very clearly that Mr. Sanchez was not lunging or going towards the officers when he was shot 5 times.
And I think this is another example, if we want to compare the other case, no video, no charges. I mean, that's where we are here in the United States. We have video, which is undisputable, then charges are filed. That's what happened in the other case. The officers were wearing body cams. Here we have no video. We have witness testimony, and we have the testimony of the officers and the impressions of the officers. Consequently, no charges. So I think the takeaway from this for cases like this, both here in Oklahoma and around the country, and we can look at the cases from around the country, no video, no charges.